everyone. Welcome to the Museum of Seminole County History. My name is Ben Lloyd. I'm coordinator here, and we're trying something a little bit different. We have an event that we've hosted annually for a while now, but with everything going on, we decided to try and move it online. So welcome to Little Wars and war games in general. We're doing a history today. So why don't we get started here? We're actually going to start with the very first set of war games. In ancient games like Polis and Pentagrammai, two players try to outmaneuver each other using armies of game pieces to surround and capture opposing units. They figuratively represent battle between lines of soldiers commanded by each player. Chess developed in India around 500 AD, possibly earlier. By 580 it arrived in Persia, where we have our first written evidence of gameplay. It is the earliest game we know of which attempts to distinguish and represent the roles of different combat units in ancient warfare accurately, rather than an abstract representation. Infantry, pawns, are not expected to capture units head-on. They hold a line so that other units can outflank the opposition. Chariots, in Persian rukh or rughs, can move quickly in straight lines and plow into enemy forces, but do not turn well. Cavalry, knights, are used for quick-turning flanking maneuvers. They advance in a direction and then turn into their opponents. Elephants, bishops, in the general rules could leap over units just like cavalry. In early chess, they could only move up to 2 spaces diagonally. During the Middle Ages, chess spread far and wide and underwent many changes. China added rivers and cannons to the board. Japan created a system for resurrecting units. Medieval Europe gave the church and the queens more power. These alterations slowly pulled chess away from its ancient beginnings into a more abstract, tactical game. As the German states squabbled and fought in the wars of the 17th and 18th century, tacticians turned to the age-old game of chess to use as a training tool in order to hone their skills. But the game left lots to be desired. It did not account for battlefield terrain or for the widespread technology of firearms. Chess variants designed to address these issues tended to keep the central game intact, and the tactics of battle had changed too much for it to remain relevant. A new generation of war games, Kriegsspiel in German, was needed. Johann Christian Ludwig Hellwig tackled the problem in 1780 with his Kriegsspiel, which he called a chess game, even though it little resembled chess at all. His toy armies used rules for modern firearms, artillery, and equipment, and fought on a large battlefield arrayed with changing terrain. With the Napoleonic War still fresh in memory, Georg Leopold von Reichwitz took this a step further in 1812, introducing a table with modular terrain tiles and increasing the complexity of the rules to simulate every variance of war. He intended his war game to train Prussian officers, and this came to fruition under his son, von Reichwitz Jr., in 1824. He scaled the armies so that they could be played on any military survey map, using hypothetical armies to conquer lands all over Europe. Prussia and the newly united German states conquered France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1873, largely due to the competent training of their officers. All of Europe took notice and began experimenting with war games themselves. Lloyd Osborne wrote to Scribner's Magazine in 1898 about a war game he played as a child with his uncle, who just happened to be the famous author Robert Louis Stevenson, Treasure Island, Kidnapped, The Black Arrow, and such books. They improvised the rules in 1885 from, quote, the humblest beginnings, a row of soldiers on either side, and a deadly marble. Slowly the rules grew more complex, and they called the construction a Kriegsspiel. When they were available, lead and tin soldiers were a staple in playrooms throughout Europe and the United States. Mold casting made them identical, easier to manufacture, and affordable for the rising middle class. And countless such games were invented independently of each other in this period. For those who could not afford it, or when metals were scarce, printing paper soldiers and dolls boomed throughout major cities all over the world. By the end of the 19th century, war games were played across floors and lawns all over Victorian Europe, and the national narrative of glorious war became worrisome for people like author H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds, The Time Machine, and other books. Wells, himself a pacifist, enjoyed playing war games as a tactical exercise between friends, but feared that the new generation of children growing up not knowing the true damage war could cause might lead to trouble in the tensely poised early 20th century Europe. Wells published Little Wars in 1913, and the game emphasized the losses and casualties war would inflict. It was the first internationally popular war game, and inspired similar publications throughout the 1910s and 1920s, but it failed to prevent the onset of World Wars I and II. After each of the world wars, organized wargaming fell out of popularity. In spite of the pacifist hopes of Stevenson and Wells, greater society felt that these games glorified war too much and didn't teach its folly and loss. But children still played with toy soldiers, and with the advent of plastic and elastilin, collecting miniature soldiers became an inexpensive, popular hobby. During the 1950s, manufacturing companies preferred to reach back to older conflicts like the Napoleonic and Civil Wars for their models. Wargames faded into more abstract exercises like Diplomacy in 1954 and Risk in 1957. Tactical wargames only began to pick up again when they were modeled after more distant time periods, like Henry H. Bodenstedt's tactical scenario The Siege of Bodenburg 1967, set in the medieval period. J.R.R. Tolkien published The Lord of the Rings between 1954 and 1955. For a generation disillusioned by the world wars, the grand mythology of Tolkien's fantasy world provided a welcome escape, and it would soon resurrect the wargame in a very different form. Inspired by the romance ideals and setting of fictional lands like Bodenburg and Middle-earth, in 1971, Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin published Chainmail, a wargame rule set they developed for medieval combat. It included a fantasy supplement containing a few fantastic monsters, rules for wizards, and spells. In 1970, Dave Arneson created a Tolkien-esque fantasy world of his own called Blackmoor, and he modified Chainmail's rules to be used in his new world. Instead of controlling armies, players controlled a single character and would negotiate their world through a referee of sorts, a neutral player. Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax released the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons in 1974, with character classes, skills, experience, and species proficiencies, but they relied on the Chainmail rule set for combat resolution. The referee facilitated the scenarios just like many of the earliest war games, but it introduced the idea that the end goal of the game was not just to win, but to tell a good story along the way. It also relied on roleplay, where the players around the table act out the interactions of their in-game characters.
A tribe of villagers are under threat from an evil force from the swamps of Kuzaton.
The roleplay model of gaming works around a table or even outdoors. Taking rule sets and acting them out in interactive storytelling is called live-action roleplay, or LARP. It is comparable to childhood pretending, but with codified rules and mechanics to simulate combat interactions, with the player dressed and acting as their character. Wargames have always struggled with the challenge of simulating simultaneous action in a believable and accurate way. After all, battles and duels are not fought turn by turn, as in chess. Kriegspiel has simultaneous turns and encounters decided by a referee. Dungeons & Dragons uses dice rolls to determine who acts first in a collaborative story run by a moderator. LARP provides a real-world environment with real-time engagement in a moderated setting, but is subject to the physical limitations of the players and the environment. Computer games provide a new solution by simulating the world and player actions in real time, whether physically possible or not. Players can control and interact with characters and environments in a role-playing game, RPG, or build buildings, conscript units, and command their armies in real-time strategy, RTS, with no limitations other than the world provides. As computers become more powerful and their technology more complex, the available genres increase too, and players worldwide can compete and cooperate in battle arenas, park simulators, puzzle platformers, and more. In this way, the direct descendants of these ancient war games are still evolving, entertaining, and educating to this day.